This is Urban Lens. One-on-one interviews with breaking artists and the history of art itself.
Basquiat, Picasso, Emory Douglas, Rembrandt, Motley,
Georgia O'Keeffe,
Kadir Nelson,
Luis Bourgeois,
Michelangelo,
Yayoi Kazama,
Donatello,
Agnes Martin,
Da Vinci,
Faith Ringgold,
Van Gogh,
Frida Kahlo,
Gauguin,
Yoko Ono,
Romer Bearden,
Barbara Kruger.
Diego.
I first initially got into street art by getting into a kind of naive graffiti. Having seen so much of it in New York City, naturally every young adult or young adolescent wants to try their hand in navigating the city in such a fashion. So did some really poor, sort of impoverished graffiti, stylistically not so good. And then I began to notice some other works that actually moved beyond the style of letter and beyond writing, became what we know today as street art. So most notably seeing the work of Elbow Toe, Swoon, Fail, Bass, Shepherd Ferry in the streets of New York. But honestly, I truly began working in street art and began my career of sorts by encountering the works online. So I actually learned about most of the works not from actually experiencing them in person in Brooklyn or Williamsburg or Crown Heights or something, or Soho. It was in fact a serendipitous meeting with someone on MySpace who introduced me to some of these blogs such as Worcester Collective and Streetsy that were instrumental in really publishing this local New York movement and to the globe. So after encountering those first blogs that covered street art.
And thanks for tuning in to Urban Lens, the art podcast. I'm Steve Gregory. And I'm excited to start today for several reasons. One, when you have super talent on the air, it's exciting. Two, I haven't been live on the air in a couple weeks, so it's good to get back. Today's artist was named in 2015 one of the 30 for 30 by Forbes magazine, art and fashion. One of those select group of people that Forbes selects every year. He was one of those 30 under 30. And so with that being said, I want to welcome Mr. Gaia to Urban Lens Podcast.
Thank you. Appreciate you for having me.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
I have so much to talk to you about. One, let's just start with your name, Gaia.
Sure.
I've read what it means, but share with us, the audience listening and watching, what Gaia means.
Sure. So, my legal name is Andrew Pizziccani, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I am predominantly a street artist cum muralist, and we're gonna talk about those distinctions between street art graffiti, murals, legal wall sanction, and everything. But because I started expressly when I was a teenager from an illegal practice, because I was strictly vandalizing property and or selling my objects inside galleries, it was like one or the other, that was a bifurcation, I need to be anonymous. And because I was continuously committing felonies, essentially, and stacking up a pretty long potential rap sheet, I had to be someone who didn't come out with my identity for a really long time. I am grateful that I chose Gaia because I could have chosen some really stupid name like Pisa 183 or the like, but instead I chose Gaia. That's the mother of Earth in Greek mythology.
The mother of Earth.
And also has a kind of new age vibe, if you will. I went to a Waldorf school. Let's put this out straight up. I'm a very privileged individual. Grew up in Manhattan. Private school educated. I've been living in Baltimore for 10 years, but grew up in the city. And so I not only had the necessity of wanting to tap into a more feminine energy, but also I wanted to be parallel and adjacent to this concept of the Gaia hypothesis, which is that Earth is a living being, and ultimately it's trying to get rid of this invasive and viral organism that is humanity through an immune response, which is global warming.
Absolutely.
So all I was trying to do was not necessarily take a position on the future of the environment and the globe that is so important and sacred to us, but instead to just take advantage of this sort of cultural zeitgeist that I felt amongst my peers in my generation, which was that there's an environmental awareness, there's something that must be done, and a lot of people were choosing consumer-oriented consumption choices like, oh, I'm going to do 7th generation tissue paper, or I'm not going to flush when I do 1 versus 2 or whatever. And that sort of had suffused a lot of my peers' general feelings toward the world and towards our economy.
Right.
So I was lucky enough that when I was 18, 17, I was prudent to choose not a silly name, and I've stuck with it. Since I've transitioned to a legal practice, my legal name is out there. I prefer having this distinction.
Absolutely.
Or even just now, there's a real personality difference between Andrew Pizziccani and Gaia. So yeah, that's the name in a nutshell.
I respect your works a lot, as you know. I wanted to ask you about the distinction between gallery work, the way you're educated, art school, how they, in a sense, how they teach is different than obviously street art. But the connection between the current trend and the current love of street art, appreciation of street art, and gallery work is there, and a lot of people are bridging it. Now, you coming from the background of formal training and a great education, transcending that to being a worldwide known mural artist is not that common. So I want to ask you about that transition from your education to a mural artist.
So I also, regarding that subject, want to also speak in terms of like being institutionally recognized versus having street cred and the difference. One thing that needs to be set up front again also is that Black and brown people really created the world and the movement that is now understood globally as graffiti. It was a method of essentially hyper-individualism, of saying, I exist, we survive, you're going to have to deal with our presence, running on the subways, running on your streets, and we're also brandable. I mean, these are people who understood that they needed to brand themselves. In a different society with a different relationship to a mixed economy, you might have a different phenomena emanating from that place. But New York was the phenomenon and the epicenter of graffiti. Since then, people have co-opted, they've borrowed, they've stolen, they've been passed the baton on from, and there's a lot of associations and sort of comparisons made between graffiti and street art. In terms of respecting those categories, we have to understand that graffiti as it's understood today is writing, and that writing is opposed to artistry, and that letter style is an artistry in and of itself, and the rules of the game in the streets have to be respected in order for you to come up as a legal muralist. If you don't have any relationship with the illegal world, then you are significantly more exposed to vandalism and the like. And so culturally, we understand these things as high and low art. And I come from an institutional background. I'm educated at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and I have a degree in sculpture. So I have always maintained my street art practice parallel to my education. Technically, I never had to go to school, if you will, but the things that I've been able to garner in my short time on this planet have been hastened by my relationship to mica. And then it's about how does one utilize that proximity to mica. You could take advantage of it, or you can parlay that into an opportunity for others to learn and gain those skills that I had the privilege to be, and the money to spend to have them in my own toolbox. I want to say that because also what's intriguing is I went to a very theory-heavy program. It was so laden with theory, and there was a lot of skills-based work as well. But for the most part, it was so laden with theory that you could be convinced that potentially you don't actually ever have to make anything, or that after 4 years in college, you actually leave with very few survival skills depending on what department you're departing from.
Absolutely.
I think this is really important because when I'm hanging out with my white artist homies, they're more concerned with conceptual issues regarding representation, but also space and context, right? Very sort of heady theoretical things. When I'm hanging out with almost anyone else beyond the white institution, especially people who know that they have to earn $1 every day to put food in their mouth and to put food in the mouth of those that they love, they're much more interested in what sells, how to sell it, how to develop one's craft, and how to cultivate it into a niche. Marxists would say that the niche is a kind of a specialization that's so sort of, I guess you'd say, individualistic about capitalism. But then hustlers and people that work hard from that multicultural context understand that they might not be able to reinvent the wheel or change the system or take the system for themselves, but they have to survive on the everyday. And so by being proximatous to the institutions that were primarily white spaces but are fortunately becoming more diverse, hopefully we're not set back by the current administration, but one does in fact never know in the United States. Right. But it's like you get the theoretical framework in one part, and that allows you to converse and discuss and exist in certain spaces, on the panel discussions and the like. And then simultaneously, I have a kind of humility that comes from the streets because you understand that that people who you're around when you're on the street level know how to survive and know how to take care of others and themselves. Which is super important for also considering how does one operate and exist within a neighborhood.
Artist Gaia comes off the wall and joins us here on Urban Lands Podcast. I want to thank Jeremy, DJ Boom, and Jay, of course, here at Listen Vision for recording and broadcasting us live to people around the world. I am taking you off the wall, Gaia. I wanted to ask you, are you unapologetically privileged?
I think it's important to be honest first and foremost. There are people that say I'd rather hang out with a racist than a white liberal because at least I know where that person stands. I think it's really important to acknowledge the things that separate and divide us so we can understand how to potentially cross and bridge those divides, or also understand that maybe those divisions are super important. Let's not, boundaries and borders are important. And then sometimes, and most often, especially from a national context or a national scale, it's important to not erect boundaries and borders, but dismantle them. Simultaneously, sometimes you have to protect yourself. I say all of these things because you should know who I am before you interact with me. And I'm going to also be straight up. In a power dynamic, the person always wins. Whoever is on top and is the middleman in a crossroads. So if you're the project manager, you're going to be the one, or the executive producer or a leader of anything, you're going to be making decisions for people intentionally or unintentionally. And intentions are not what's important. It's action that is important. And ultimately, what is the final solution? What's the end game? What's the goal? What are your means to the end? And a lot of people of color get burned collaborating with white artists in a public context. I mean, don't get me wrong. I have plenty of people that are very close to me. Especially when you're a white man as a minority, a privileged and powerful minority, when you're a white man in a black neighborhood, you have been given access that is extremely valuable. And if you sacrifice that, your whole career and life's work could be gone. And then when other white artists come into any neighborhood, we're just talking about black in particular because we're in DC, Baltimore, But let's say you're in Chinatown, whatever. Any context where your whiteness is somehow in contrast, then one must acknowledge these power dynamics so one can be aware, and so one doesn't take advantage or potentially just steal and take and oppress. I don't mean to brag too much fascination on white supremacy, especially by white people, sort of reifies white supremacy. But I just want to say that I've been given these things by people like my parents, who I love and admire.
Absolutely.
And so I have to be grateful for the efforts that they've made. You know, like my great-grandfather came from Italy. His son-in-law was a garbage man. His children were financial advisors and dentists. Their children were artists and creative types, right? That's 4 generations of work to put money into my body to educate it and that brain. And I want to be able to share those skills.
It's important. I think it's important, and I asked that question because, you know, you should be unapologetically privileged as that's what you are, because it's not something you did.
Well, it's not something to be ashamed of.
It's
either.
not something to be ashamed of, and
It's
this is your parents' work, and those are people who are in poverty as well. You also have to be unapologetically proud of being poor and try to strive. But it's something. Just wanted to touch on that. Just it's
Totally.
a humble. You can say that with complete humility, and I kind of sense that about you. I wanted to get back into art a little bit. So we came into the segment with the film of you painting in Istanbul, in Turkey. I want to touch on artists' social responsibility. Do you find that the artists in the States, and you're one of the top mural artists in the States, let alone the world, so I can actually tap into your brain on this subject, do you find that people around the world who are in more, I guess, I don't want to rate anyone's oppression, but do you find that artists around the world are more expressive in their work than people in the States? They're more willing to take a risk and say something political, or do you find the state still is leading in that category?
Yeah, I mean, I think the oppression measurement is obviously not a useful road to go down. It just depends on how eloquently one can speak within a certain context. And certain individuals are more fitted to speak within and articulately within a space, especially if it belongs to them. So you can most likely provide tremendous insight into your neighborhood, while it might be a little bit more difficult about someone else's neighborhood. You can read primary and secondary sources. You can have conversations with the residents, conversations with stakeholders, various institutions, organizations, and the like, etc. But one can only gain so much of an intimate vision of a space. Having lived in a place gives one a more insight, and so potentially one can artistically express oneself about that house, place, region, state, nation, continent, if you will. And I think that in terms of revolutionary art emanating from anywhere, I think within my travels, potentially one of the most vibrant and very much anti-authoritarian and authentically anti-authoritarian voice, because don't get me wrong, in the United States, the aesthetics of rebellion are often more important for branding techniques rather than actually dismantling a power structure and setting up new policy or rewarding new people who have been disparaged by a certain system, or making the system more equitable or more inequitable depending on the direction of that revolution. But in the United States, because we're so hyper-individualistic, because we're so not community-oriented, I'm talking on a national scale.
Absolutely.
Because of this hyper-individualism and this branding and this notion that we're all hyper-individuals versus defined by our community and our context, there's a lot more of the aesthetics of what might look like rebellious, basically going through the motions versus doing the difficult work. And Colombia and Bogota was maybe the most pronounced, most anti-authoritarian voice that I've seen with the most spots painted.
Right.
It was, I mean, just unbelievable.
Right.
So yeah, that's sort of my U.S. versus the rest of the world. take.
Instantly, I thought about the I don't know if you recall the first Apple ad, the TV ad where they had The people all looking and
Oh yeah, the first
yes, the very first one.
Exactly. This
So,
notion that
right.
you can buy into something
And it's Apple
that's
who did that.
somehow anti-authoritarian,
Right,
right?
absolutely.
Like you're taking down the man or the
Absolutely.
management. You're somehow not. It's ironic that
And they become the juggernaut they were fighting against in
It's-
that first ad.
it's ironic that people protesting against, or an advertisement or a multinational protesting against surveillance has now become one of the largest apparati
Amen.
for
Yes,
surveillance
sir.
within our modern world, or modern era. So, yeah, but that's also like a trope and an endless cycle that exists with any branding environment.
Absolutely.
You're just taking down the competition. You're not dismantling the system.
Right.
You're just saying that I want to be on top, not them.
Right.
You're not saying, okay, maybe we should reposition the top, or maybe we should bring the top down so that we can have a stronger base or a stronger
Right.
middle. It's all economics and policy. So
Right.
a lot of this, kind of fuzzy and nebulous aesthetic questions can really be boiled down to really hard decisions
Absolutely.
that just need to be made.
So Jackson Pollock says, every great artist paints what he or she is. What is Gaia?
So Gaia is someone whose work is place-based and uses the crutch, if you will, not to, to be a little bit inconsiderate of myself or to be a little bit less generous towards myself. I can essentially use the context as a crutch, meaning I'll constantly have new content. Now, granted, I believe that everyone, especially an outsider, especially in a country that has never figured out its settler futurity or has never found a peaceful agreement between the classic settler-slave native dynamic for 400 years. In that situation, I believe an outsider should always be a net benefit to the community they're coming into, right? So there has to be real monetary and material, and then conceptual and aesthetic benefits of me being within a place that I don't belong to. And I have, fortunately and strangely, found and cultivated a practice that allows me to leave something that's considered beautiful and even considered participatory, transcendent, aspirational, and celebratory. So I actually have something I can give to people and empower them either through passing the mic completely on, speaking for them, which is an extremely problematic position as a white man, or at least compensating people for their collaborative and participatory endeavors and also their insight into their place. So Gaia is someone who's simply a conceptual artist that decides to place things within a certain context. I just say, this should be there. And I either make unilateral or multilateral decisions depending on whether it's an illegal or legal practice. If I need to, call out a developer and do a big, protest piece on their building, if I need to write a very clear message that's political and is unambiguous, then I'll most likely generally consult individuals that I respect and admire to gain their insight, and then take on the risk in my personal body. Or if it's a legal perspective or a much more nuanced message needs to be conveyed, then I take a much more multilateral approach. Slowly running the concept by certain people, improvising accordingly, and by certain people I mean stakeholders within the community or within a concept. And then hopefully, once you grind hard enough and can develop a market, compensating everyone accordingly, because once again, money is king.
Have you ever considered yourself anything other than an artist?
Since I was 18 and had to make a decision about which route I would take in my education, I've only considered myself an artist, otherwise known as an author.
Okay.
I'm sure I am many other things, but that has been my prominent modality in my life, and I will continue to exist in that capacity. I would say the alternative is just understanding artists as informal laborers.
Do you remember the first piece of art that you created that you actually liked?
No. My God, no. I'm never perfectly content with my work. Well, there's a lot of moving parts, right?
And that's common. I'm just wondering. Think back now.
But it's also like...
Do you remember the first piece that you actually smiled and said, you know what? I actually like that. Even if you're 16. I actually think I'm an artist. When did you realize,
I'm just saying the biggest and most satisfying moments for me are when the work really resonates with a lot of people in a public context. When I'm out on the street and it's really hitting home, and a lot of people are congratulating me, and maybe it's multiplying into other opportunities, because a lot of times I do things very informally. We'll start with a free mural somewhere on the west side in Baltimore, and that'll multiply into another location. And then it might turn into another location. And as much free paint as I have, because I keep all my paint from my paid jobs, we could just keep on rolling. Maybe I'll invite some new cats on the scene who might want to, get their chops up, learn some new skills, paint alongside them, teach them. And it starts gyrating almost out of control to the point where you could paint a whole neighborhood, if you will, and kind of give it, granted one has enough time and money. And often in my free time, sometimes I'll get one or two other murals out of it. And that just feels somehow holistic and true and authentic. You're like cultivating a relationship with people slowly on the street throughout the week, and then throughout the months and the years, you continue to return to your places. So I only say this because I can barely remember all the work that I create. I create so much work, and I'm such a numbers guy.
Yeah.
Like, I'm so much like, this year I want to do 24 murals a year. So that means 2 weeks a mural. That's 3 days on either end for traveling and recuperating, and that's about 8 days of implementation. And then let's pop this off. Let's bounce to the next place. I mean, there was a point where I had done a mural in Ostrava in the Czech Republic. Then I went to Praha and Katowice and did a little tour around Poland, finished a wall in Łódź, flew over to Ukraine, did a 17-story wall in Ukraine after those other two massive murals. And we're talking rain, everything. And then my homie in South America, Entes, was like, dude, I'm doing a project in Paraguay. How about you come directly from Ukraine? So I just came off a 17-story wall, take a 30-hour flight, land in Paraguay in Asuncion. Right. Totally different cultures, totally different worlds. I mean, we're talking Ukraine versus Paraguay.
Right.
Like
right.
The jungle versus a city. And then I hopped off, did a 15-story wall, and then came back home. So, in the course of a month, I did 4 walls, and they were all average around 8 to 17 stories. So I see it as you can only get better by constantly keeping your mechanization or the machine that is your body primed and ready, and then see every instance as another opportunity for research, investigation, and then just trying one more time. So it's almost I'm trying to see what sticks by trying out a lot of different things and experimenting. So it all kind of becomes one diffuse memory. So I don't have anything that really sticks with me, but I have some crazy stories.
That you just said them. You said enough. That was beautiful.
I gotta think about
I want to. We're gonna take a short break quickly, but I wanted to get your opinion about a phrase that a mutual friend of ours, another mural artist, Jeff Huntington. He said he called his work. He described your work and his work as contemporary public art. I thought it was very adequate. I thought it was, but I wanted to get your opinion as someone who is actually in it. Tell me about your thoughts on contemporary public art as a category.
So I believe that nowadays especially it becomes very difficult to categorize, but categories are extremely necessary for understanding what is it in fact that you are doing. I'm not interested in saying, categories are unimportant. But
contemporary public art is a less problematic way of thinking about things because at least contemporary acknowledges something that's present, like presently occurring.
Absolutely.
And that's an umbrella and weird term, but at least it acknowledges a nounness and a pertinence, if you will.
Absolutely.
So there has to be a level of pertinence, like you have to be relevant, and that's decided from two angles, from the institutional top-down angle and from the populist, common denominator angle. They meet in the middle somehow. But other terms that were utilized in the past were like urban art, which is really stupid and dumb. It's kind of like calling, Jankos in the 90s or like something that's sort of more urban. It's a very strange way of thinking about a context. Once again, it's just context-based work. So I'll do a rural environment if it makes sense and is necessary. Now, that comes down to all sorts of other questions about who's your audience and how are they going to encounter the work and the like. But it's still installation-based work through the image, through the static image, or thinking about image. So, contemporary public art is more relevant, like it's getting there. Now, capital P, capital A public art is its own world.
So it's still evolving.
Well, I think that you may have encountered finally a movement colloquially understood as street art, capital S, capital A, which I say has to be illegal. Otherwise, how are we going to differentiate it from murals? Murals are murals. We talked about the Sistine Chapel.
Absolutely.
Or we talked about any other cave painting or any other sort of human approach to the wall, to the muro, to the wall. I don't see much difference. The technology hasn't changed. The only thing that changes anything categorically really is technology and a conceptual shift that occurs simultaneously with a new technology. That happened in the 60s and 70s once you have the invention of aerosol spray paint. That's a technology that changed the world. Now, like pigments made in the Renaissance versus any good exterior latex paint, that's a really slow shift. That's not a massive jump. There's no disruption there. That's 500 years of just chipping away at making more durable things, coats of paint outside. But I'll say all this stuff is that street art may be the first thing to really escape not only institutions, but our sort of lexical understanding of what a movement is. It's just too broad and too visible to understand it as 26 dudes living in a certain neighborhood in a certain time as a school. Abstract expressionism, there were thousands of people doing exactly what Pollock was doing, but we only understand and remember a handful. Street art, because it's such an online and lives virtually, it is the baby of social media and has literally come of age as the notion of virality has matured. You can't not see the thousands of authors producing every day, simultaneously, all over the world, and still there are ignored contexts. So it's not something that can be contained or easily distilled into a phrase per se.
Absolutely. We're going to take a short break. When we get back, I want to discuss with Gaia his appearance in the Forbes 30 for 30 list and what that's done for his career and how he felt about that. When we get back again, I guess I want to also get into some of your travels.
Sure.
I'd like to do that because that's important. And we're also going to show more of your art because we haven't done enough of that. For those who are watching on Listen Vision, this is radio you can watch, so we're going to take advantage of that and show your art. Come back. I'm Steve Gregory. This is Urban Lens Podcast.
Thank you.
Matisse,
Kara Elizabeth Walker.
Jackson Pollock, Gordon Parks.
Urban Lens is a great opportunity for the creatives among us to tell those stories, inspire others, and sell their art.
We're taking the artists off the wall, covering events like Art Basel in Miami, Coachella, London Fashion Week.
Art means expressing yourself. Art means bringing the world closer. Art means creating something that everyone can see beauty in. back to the Urban Lens Podcast. I am Steve Gregory, and I am exactly on my 6th episode here. We are. And it's really exciting just when you find talent like this gentleman here who can also express himself so eloquently. I could just shut up and listen to him, actually. And that's my job, really, to try and introduce you to, bring you off the wall and have people who are art fans, art supporters, art enthusiasts, get to know people behind the paint. And so I want to also, before we show more of your art, I want to talk about your travels. You mentioned like 6 countries you've been all over the world. Is there any country that, I talked about the social activism of artists, but let's talk about the actual admiration of public art, because I do know that, and Jeff spoke on this too, several artists speak on this, especially public artists, contemporary public artists, speak on sometimes even legally you have challenges. Even visually, aesthetically, people are like, I don't want that, that's graffiti. Is there a country that you've traveled on that you feel like appreciates the street art more than this country? Or how are we in that race as far as appreciating street art?
Sure. So I've painted on every habitable continent on this planet, and that includes Perth and Australia. So I've been around, interacted with many different cultures that have various different relationships with representation versus non-representational art. I'm a representational and figurative artist, right? Mm-hmm. And that comes from a certain aesthetic regime, history, and legacy. So there are parts of the world where depictions of certain entities or my subjective understanding of a signifier or symbol may come crashing into someone else's life and mean something radically different. In tribal contexts, in smaller village contexts, that one can be very prone to those kinds of misunderstandings because there's already generally a language barrier between the outsider parachute muralist who's just dropping in to do the thing and then bouncing, and we're still spending a lot of time within that community, but one is always inherently an outsider in my line of work. Versus, people who have, or are part of a culture that has maybe even invented the notion and the concept of Western painting. So Italy, for example, I'm Italian. I go back 2 or 3 times a year, and I get a lot of work out there. And interestingly enough, the notion and the idea of an artist as a privileged author is almost sacrosanct, where clients, organizations, institutions, and all other stakeholders will literally give you significantly more free rein because they understand that what's going to be attractive is my vision, especially from a branding or creative placemaking strategy or gentrification or reinvestment strategy, depending on how you want to look at it. And so the only problems I ever get in Italy are they're terrible workers. I can say this because I'm Italian, so they cannot get up and or do anything before noon. And then there's the meal, there's the coffee, there's the cigarette, there's the kind of the entitled nature of like, hey, it's the weekend. Americans are hustlers. We're self-exploiters. We'll work until we die. Italians have a lust for life that I can't personally understand, but admire. Right. But they under, the aesthetic world, especially from a Western context, really is theirs. And so they're living amongst the Vatican and Firenze and Milano and all the way down to Palermo. There's beautiful Baroque and medieval and everything. Where I have, and so I mean that to literally say I have the most artistic freedom, which can be bad. Mm-hmm. I don't consider myself someone who knows a lot about much of anything. And I'm in a lot of places where I'm consistently almost hackneyed or at a disadvantage because I have to always catch up with trying to learn about a place to make relevant content for that place, something that will resonate, reflect, and or be a provocative, antagonistic or agonistic gesture. I have to locate whether I want to be antagonistic or assimilative, or somehow celebratory and aspirational versus radical and revolutionary, and then, chart the course for getting to that goal. So Italy, the most freedom, but then when you have the most freedom, one can make the most mistakes. You have a lot less checks and balances, and so that one can misspeak more easily. In the United States, people are very, very they will readily provide their input because we have an understanding that like we all of our opinions matter, and we're part of this like democracy, as if we're somehow like all rocking togas all the time and like doing Socratic whatever. It's like, but people will always provide input. It can be a distraction. It can be extremely invigorating depending on what kind of person you are and how you work. I have had issues in certain religious contexts. You know, certain things have been erased that I've been painted, certain misunderstandings. I once painted a kudu and a leopard with a Belgian collar, like, you know, colonialism in Cape Town in South Africa. Horizontally, I painted it, and I had a Muslim gentleman come through in that night, or as this is how it was explained to me. This could be a total mythology,
Right.
because once again, you're talking about word of mouth and story, and
in
literally
somebody's
the
community where
streets
you're a
are
visitor.
defined
Right.
by that. And I don't know anyone intimately, so
Right.
I'm just sort of the fool,
Right.
if you will. I mean, I can hear totally different stories, and if it convinces me, anyway. But I was told that a gentleman who was religiously upright was offended by the horns because they were satanic and erased them. And so then I came back the next day in Afrikaans. I had a hand with an eraser, and I had it erasing my own painting, and I said to erase revisionism. Which is
I
sort
saw
of-
that.
Sort of like
I didn't understand the context of it, but I did see
folding
that.
of that. So that's the story behind it. You see the finished piece,
Right.
and then you see the erased piece, and then the new addition to that
Right.
piece. I believe in improvisation and being someone who could be malleable and flexible. You know, listen to people who say no. You know, a big part of my work is about walking away from projects, because sometimes you're not the right author and the right artist. And if you have the privilege and the income to be able to say, you know, like, I'm doing well, I'm eating right now, I don't think I'm the most suitable. I've got a whole host of other people who I think might be more up your alley. That's a real wonderful position to be in.
Absolutely. What's more challenging to you at this point in your career, the canvas or the wall?
Once again, I think that there's this distinction that's made somehow that I'm trying to destroy. Because once again, I acknowledge my privilege, and to be perfectly frank, most street artists nowadays, that's changing as more people are fighting to gain the platform for speaking on such a grand scale. But for the past 10 years, there's been a lot of white and European dudes. I mean, white is European, but a lot of European authors, you know, gallivanting around the world doing the street art thing, and because they're controlling the narrative and the representation, it just looks like a bunch of people are always super grateful for this thing that just came out of the sky, and they're like, thank you. That's changing as more people are fighting for space, but I want to acknowledge the aristocratic nature of street art. You know, these are mostly institutionally educated people who come almost backwards if you want to use a progressive or linear approach, but socially we understand it as coming down into the streets. A lot of people will do that from a guerrilla branding perspective. So there is no distinction between the gallery and the mural. All that they care about, myself included, I hate to be so cynical, and I do have a lot of pride and hope in my work as well, and have instilled that upon people and have received that myself with my collaborators. But I also know that, let's be perfectly frank, this isn't street art most of the time, it's guerrilla branding.
Let's
People
go
are
ahead.
giving you a recognizable thing that you can buy inside, but you've been seeing it outside, so you want to buy into it. And so you can cop the t-shirt, or you can cop the canvas, or you can see it on the street. They're not diametrically opposed to each other at all, except from a technical issue. I'll make it simple. Painting a canvas is always easier because the weather's not a factor.
I want to go to some of your art, and as we do that, can you talk about the Forbes 30 for 30, how it came about, and what has it done for your career? How was that? Did you enjoy it?
I think I have to tread very lightly when I speak about the Forbes 30 under 30. All that I've received from the Forbes 30 under 30, to be perfectly frank, is a couple consulting gigs.
Okay.
I'm going to say this straight up.
Okay.
I am not an optimistic person unnecessarily. I do not believe in the individual and individualism or hyper individualism, and I don't believe in thinking individually versus systemically. Forbes 30 under 30 is all about geniuses, entrepreneurs, visionaries, forward thinkers, I don't believe in any of that. I think that there are invisible people that are supporting those people. I think there are all sorts of things that we haven't seen prior to them being on stage, and those are the things we need to be talking about.
Absolutely.
What is it that is taking you to that stage to speak on this scale? What has allowed you to have that platform? Because it's not your entrepreneurial spirit. It's your position within a structural framework and your relation to equity and inequity. And so I think I fit the idea of a visionary and someone who's
100%.
The lone wolf, and I'm out there in the streets just doing my thing, climbing billboards, meeting leaders of nations and collaborating with like embassies and then big multinationals and drug dealers and mothers and grandmothers and everyone in the world, I could potentially work with if we have a message to convey. And I've worked with a lot of different people, but the Forbes 30, I'm an anarchist at heart. I don't think that anarchism per se has any place in our society in a mixed economy, but conceptually, it's a great way to fight fascism, and it's a really important anti-racist tool from a human level, not necessarily institutional level. And so my anarchist/anarcho-syndicalist tendencies really begin to create a schizophrenic headspace whenever I'm in very corporate, very aspirational, very, very forward thinking, because when one looks too far forward, one loses the scale of humanity. One loses the value of human life.
Artist Gaia here comes off the wall on Urban Lens Podcast. I do want to go to some of his art, and quickly, if you could, when James pulls him up, when Jay pulls him up, if you could just kind of talk about the mural, the country, put it in context for us. We're going to try and get through as many as possible before the program ends.
Sure. So this is the piece that I was talking about in Łódź in Poland. This is in central Poland. What you have is Kosciuszko next to Jefferson. Jefferson, in his will, and he acknowledged that humans should never be considered property. And Kosciuszko was made the executor of Jefferson's will.
Okay.
Kosciuszko wanted to emancipate Jefferson's slaves. Eventually, Jefferson's estate got caught up in all sorts of legal battles, and they weren't. Kosciuszko ended up fighting for revolutionary values in American soil and
where is
European
this?
soil, in Łódź, in Poland.
In Poland.
And so you have Kosciuszko on the far left, Jefferson with the shackles over his face, then a statue of Kosciuszko prior to the Nazis, then a demolition of the statue, and then a re-erection of that later. So we're talking about humans and liberal aspirations, essentially democracy and voyeurism and tourism. Here's a more simple piece. This is in Kiev in Ukraine. You have the figure of St. Michael stabbing himself rather than stabbing a dragon or Satan, depending on whether you want to consider the St. George or the St. Michael archetype. Here you have a piece that was actually done in Washington Heights in New York. It's all about endangered species and about globalization and migration, the movement of peoples. So this is in a formerly black neighborhood, now Dominican neighborhood. So you have images also from the Great Migration there, but then you have migratory birds. This is a piece that's all about phenotype, settler futurity, and the distinction between Native and European, or
Beautiful work.
a Lenape person more specifically versus what would be understood as a European phenotype.
I wanted to mention to people they can check your work out at your website, Gaia, Gaia, streetart.com. Correct?
Yes, sir.
Gaia,
Yes, sir.
streetart.com. Please, I encourage you, support the artist. Definitely follow his projects. And I want to, before you go, actually talk about this piece quickly.
So this is actually a really, really wonderful piece. I can't talk about this very quickly, so I'm going to try to make this, distill it as quickly as I can.
It's beautiful.
It's
I mean,
Wilhelmina Johnson
Okay.
versus Jack Kerouac. They're both big figures that were important to the people that maintain this garden and space right here.
Okay.
But I wanted to celebrate a local black figure in particular because Gainesville is so
And this
black.
is Gainesville, Florida.
This is Gainesville, Florida. So the poets and the people and the artists who maintain the space wanted Jack Kerouac. I wanted a strong black woman in particular. We finally found Wilhelmina Johnson's portrait. She was an educator and community organizer. She did not have a portrait in the local, historical archives. Nothing in the local museum, in the
Wow.
Madison collection.
Wow.
And her name was around, and we were hearing it and seeing it, but we really wanted to get an image of her. We finally located one, depicted her, and even had a surviving family member come and visit the piece.
Wow.
So it was like we were doing like investigative work.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I also, part of Urban Lens is to get people to support you in the way that matters a lot of times, and that is financially. Buy your art, support yourself.
Sure.
How does that happen? Like, as far as a mural artist, and yourself in particular, they can't buy the wall. So how do you transcend that into people who are listening or watching so they can support you financially and follow your work?
So I do have objects that I sell, prints and paintings and the like. Those are all available. In London, I have some print house in particular named Nellie Duff, and there are some available prints online as well. Los Angeles and the like.
Nellie Duff, what is that? Explain that to me.
I have no idea.
Okay.
That's the name of their
Okay.
gallery.
Okay.
I've just been working with them forever, and they're
Okay.
really tremendous.
You had a solo
supporters
show
of me.
in London, correct?
I've had a couple of different solo shows, here in DC and in London, Italy, and the like. Rice University, I've done one. And
Do you prefer the admiration of someone loving your installation in a gallery or someone standing in front of your wall in amazement?
so much more than mural.
So much
I
more
don't
mural.
think I've ever really been able to successfully tackle the gallery space, but the mural I can do with my eyes closed and have gotten my technical skills up to a certain position where it just flows. And so there's a lot less stress now, and there's a lot more enjoyment of the input and of, once again, being flexible and listening on the ground, making small arrangements, small shifts, and once again feeling as if I can be improvisational because I've mastered a particular technique.
I wanted to encourage everyone again, log onto his website, follow his work. It's beautiful stuff. What is your next project? What's coming next for Gaia?
So I just finished a mural that I paid for in collaboration with the Neighborhood Design Council on the east side of Baltimore at the Duncan Street Miracle Garden. It was run and managed since 1988 by a gentleman named Mr. Sharp. We just finished that this week. We want to celebrate his legacy and his commitment to a city that has been forgotten and has been sort of left abandoned by so many other people. And so he was holding it down in the interim for his neighborhood to create the lungs of the neighborhood, if you will. So we did that mural. Next, some Baltimore mural projects, paid gigs. Looking forward to that. Some projects out in hopefully the Netherlands and, of course, in Italy. And then some institutional things on the
Hopefully
horizon.
Oakland in May.
Hopefully Oakland in May.
I wanted
We'll
to
see what
quickly,
we
can
do.
people donate to the Legacy Project?
Sure. I mean, they could. Right now, actually, what I've done is taken a project that was known as the Legacy Project, which was identifying political rifts within the urban renewal context and that history of reinvestment by the federal agencies.
We got to
from
have you back on
40s
because
to
we're out of
70s.
time. We got to
Sure.
have you back on.
But-
thank everyone for listening to Urban Lens Podcast. This
Come
is
through.
Gaia, streetart.com. We'll see you next week right here on Listen Vision.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate
Art means story, life story, and bringing people together. It's a connector. It's your pain. It's your agony. It's what your perspective in the world is.
Art can be beautiful and art can be ugly.
Beautifully ugly.
This is Urban Lens. Urban Lens.